Hello, dear friends, and welcome. Enjoy listening. Agatha Christie, The Face of Helen. Mr. Satterthwaite was at the opera and sat alone in his big box on the first tier outside the door. Was a printed card bearing his name. An appreciator and a connoisseur of all the arts, Mr. Satterthwaite was especially fond of good music and was a regular subscriber to Covent Garden every year, reserving a box for Tuesdays and Fridays throughout the season. But it was not often that he sat in it alone. He was a gregarious little gentleman, and he liked filling his box with the elite of the great world to which he belonged, and also with the aristocracy of the artistic world in which he was equally at home. He was alone tonight because a countess had disappointed him. The countess, besides being a beautiful and celebrated woman, was also a good mother. Her children had been attacked by that common and distressing disease, the mumps, and the countess remained at home in tearful confabulation with exquisitely starched nurses. Her husband, who had supplied her with the aforementioned children and a title, but who was otherwise a complete nonentity, had seized at the chance to escape. Nothing bought him more than music, so Mr. Satterthwaite sat alone. Cavalier Rusticot and Pagliacci were being given that night, and since the first had never appealed to him, he arrived just after the curtain went down on Santussa's death agony, in time to glance round the house with practiced eyes before everyone streamed out, bent on paying visits or fighting for coffee or lemonade. Mr. Satterthwaite adjusted his opera glasses, looked round the house, marked down his prey, and sallied forth with a well-mapped-out plan of laud campaign ahead of him. A plan, however, which he did not put into execution, for just outside his box he cannoned into a tall, dark man, and recognized him with a pleasurable thrill of excitement. "Mr. Quinn," cried Mr. Satterthwaite. He seized his friend warmly by the hand, clutching him as though he feared any minute to see him vanish into thin air. "You must share my box," said Mr. Satterthwaite determinedly. "You are not with a party?" "No, I am sitting by myself in the stalls," responded Mr. Quinn with a smile. "Then that is settled," said Mr. Satterthwaite with a sigh of relief. His manner was almost comic, had there been anyone to observe it. "You are very kind," said Mr. Quinn. "Not at all. It is a pleasure. I didn't know you were fond of music. There are reasons why I am. Attracted to Pagliacci." "Of course," said Mr. Satterthwaite, nodding sapiently, though if put to it he would have found it hard to explain just why he had used that expression. "Of course you would be." They went back to the box at the first summons of the bell, and leaning over the front of it, they watched the people returning to the stalls. "That is a beautiful head," observed Mr. Satterthwaite suddenly. He indicated with his glasses a spot immediately beneath them in the stall circle. A girl sat there whose face they could not see, only the pure gold of her hair that fitted with the closeness of a cap till it merged into the white neck. "A Greek head," said Mr. Satterthwaite reverently. "Pure Greek," he sighed happily. "Odd it is a remarkable thing when you come to think of it, how very few people have hair that fits them. It is more noticeable now that everyone is shingled." "You are so observant," said Mr. Quinn. "I see things," admitted Mr. Satterthwaite. "I do see things. For instance, I picked out that head at once. We must have a look at her face sooner or later, but it won't match, I'm sure. That will be a chance in 1,000. Almost as the words left his lips, the lights flickered and went down. The sharp rap of the conductor's baton was heard, and the opera began. A new tenor, said to be a second Caruso, was singing that night. He had been referred to by the newspapers as a Jugoslav, a Czech, an Albanian, a Magyar, and a Bulgarian with a beautiful impartiality. He had given an extraordinary concert at the Albert Hall, a program of the folk songs of his native hills, with a specially tuned orchestra. They were in strange halftones, and the would-be musical had pronounced them too marvelous. Real musicians had reserved judgment, realizing that the ear had to be specially trained and attuned before any criticism was possible. It was quite a relief to some people to find this evening that Joe Ashbeam could sing in ordinary Italian with all the traditional sobs and quivers. The curtain went down on the first act, and applause burst out vociferously. Mr. Satterthwaite turned to Mr. Quinn. He realized that the latter was waiting for him to pronounce judgment and plumed himself a little. After all, he knew, as a critic, he was well-nigh infallible. Very slowly he nodded his head. "It is the real thing," he said. "You think so? as fine a voice as Caruso's. People will not recognize that it is so at first, for his technique is not yet perfect. There are ragged edges, a lack of certainty in the attack, but the voice is there. Magnificent. I went to his concert at the Albert Hall, said Mr. Quinn. Did you? I could not go. He made a wonderful hit with a shepherd's song. I read about it, said Mr. Satterthwaite. The refrain ends each time with a high note, a kind of cry, a note midway between A and B flat. Very curious. Doashbeam had taken 3 calls, bowing and smiling. The lights went up and the people began to file out. Mr. Satterthwaite leant over to watch the girl with the golden head. She rose, adjusted her scarf, and turned. Mr. Satterthwaite caught his breath. There were, he knew, such faces in the world, faces that made history. The girl moved to the gangway, her companion a young man beside her, and Mr. Satterthwaite noticed how every man in the vicinity looked and continued to look covertly. Beauty, said Mr. Satterthwaite to himself, there is such a thing. Not charm, nor attraction, nor magnetism, nor any of the things we talk about so glibly, just sheer beauty. The shape of a face, the line of an eyebrow, the curve of a jaw. He quoted softly under his breath, the face that launched 1,000 ships, and for the first time he realized the meaning of those words. He glanced across at Mr. Quinn, who was watching him in what seemed such perfect comprehension that Mr. Satterthwaite felt there was no need for words. I've always wondered, he said simply, what such women were really like. You mean? The Helens, the Cleopatras, the Mary Stuarts. Mr. Quinn nodded thoughtfully. If we go out, he suggested, we may see. They went out together and their quest was successful. The pair they were in search of was seated on a lounge halfway up the staircase. For the first time, Mr. Satterthwaite noted the girl's companion, a dark young man, not handsome, but with a suggestion of restless fire about him. A face full of strange angles, jutting cheekbones, a forceful, slightly crooked jaw, deep-set eyes that were curiously light under the dark, overhanging brows. An interesting face, said Mr. Satterthwaite to himself. A real face? It means something. The young man was leaning forward, talking earnestly. The girl was listening. Neither of them belonged to Mr. Satterthwaite's world. He took them to be of the arty class. The girl wore a rather shapeless garment of cheap green silk. Her shoes were of soiled white satin. The young man wore his evening clothes with an air of being uncomfortable in them. The 2 men passed and repassed several times. The 4th time they did so, the couple had been joined by a 3rd, a fair young man with a suggestion of the clerk about him. With his coming, a certain tension had set in. The newcomer was fidgeting with his tie and seemed ill at ease. The girl's beautiful face was turned gravely up towards him, and her companion was scowling furiously. The usual story, said Mr. Quinn very softly as they passed. Yes, said Mr. Satterthwaite with a sigh. It's inevitable, I suppose. The snarling of 2 dogs over a bone. It always has been. It always will be. And yet, one could wish for something different. Beauty. He stopped. Beauty to Mr. Satterthwaite meant something very wonderful. He found it difficult to speak of it. He looked at Mr. Quinn, who nodded his head gravely in understanding. They went back to their seats for the 2nd act. At the close of the performance, Mr. Satterthwaite turned eagerly to his friend. It is a wet night. My car is here. You must allow me to drive you. Are somewhere. The last word was Mr. Satterthwaite's delicacy coming into play. To drive you home would, he felt, have savored of curiosity. Mr. Quinn had always been singularly reticent. It was extraordinary how little Mitten Satterthwaite knew about him. But perhaps, continued the little man, you have your own car waiting. No, said Mr. Quinn, I have no car waiting. Then, but Mr. Quinn shook his head. You are most kind, he said, but I prefer to go my own way. Besides, he said with a rather curious smile, if anything should happen, it will be for you to act. Good night and thank you. Once again we have seen D-drama together. He had gone so quickly that Mr. Satterthwaite had no time to protest, but he was left with a faint uneasiness stirring in his mind. To what drama did Mr. Quinn refer, Pagliacci or another? Masters. Mr. Satterthwaite's chauffeur was in the habit of waiting in a side street. His master disliked the long delay while the cars drew up in turn before the opera house. Now, as on previous occasions, he walked rapidly round the corner and along the street towards where he knew he should find Masters awaiting him. Just in front of him were a girl and a man, and even as he recognized them, another man joined them. It all broke out in a minute. a man's voice angrily uplifted, another man's voice in injured protest, and then the scuffle. Blows, angry breathing, more blows, the form of a policeman appearing majestically from nowhere, and in another minute Mr. Satterthwaite was beside the girl where she shrank back against the wall. "Allow me," he said. "You must not stay here." He took her by the arm and marshaled her swiftly down the street. Once she looked back. "Oughtn't I?" she began uncertainly. Mr. Satterthwaite shook his head. "It would be very unpleasant for you to be mixed up in it. You would probably be asked to go along to the police station with them. I am sure neither of your friends would wish that." He stopped. "This is my car. If you will allow me to do so, I shall have much pleasure in driving you home." The girl looked at him searchingly. The staid respectability of Mr. Satterthwaite impressed her favorably. She bent her head. "Thank you," she said, and got into the car, the door of which Ben Masters was holding open. In reply to a question from Mr. Satterthwaite, she gave an address in Chelsea, and he got in beside her. The girl was upset and not in the mood for talking, and Mr. Satterthwaite was tactful to intrude upon her thoughts. Presently, however, she turned to him and spoke of her own accord. "I wish," she said pettishly, "people wouldn't be so silly." "It is a nuisance," agreed Mr. Satterthwaite. His matter-of-fact manner put her at her ease, and she went on as though feeling the need of confiding in someone. "It wasn't as though... well, it was like this. Mr. Eastney and I have been friends for a long time. Ever since I came to London. He's taken no end of trouble about my voice and got me some very good introductions, and he's been more kind to me than I can say. He's absolutely music mad. It was very good of him. Ought to take me tonight. I'm sure he can't really afford it. And then Mr. Burns came up and spoke to us, quite nicely I'm sure, and Mr. Eastney got sulky about it. I don't know why he should. It's a free country, I'm sure. Mr. Burns is always pleasant and good-tempered. Then just as we were walking to the tube, he came up and joined us, and he hadn't so much as said 2 words before Philip flew out at him like a madman. And, I don't like it." "Don't you?" asked Mr. Satterthwaite very softly. She blushed, but very little. There was none of the conscious siren about her. A certain measure of pleasurable excitement in being fought for there must be. That was only nature. But Mr. Satterthwaite decided that a worried perplexity lay uppermost, and he had the clue to it in another moment when she observed inconsequently, "I do hope he hasn't hurt him." "Now which is him?" thought Mr. Satterthwaite, smiling to himself in the darkness. He backed his own judgment and said, "You hope, Mr. Herp? Eastney hasn't hurt Mr. Burns?" She nodded. "Yes, that's what I said. It seems so dreadful. I wish I knew." The car was drawing up. "Are you on the telephone?" he asked. "Yes. If you like, I will find out exactly what has happened and then telephone to you." The girl's face brightened. "Oh, that would be very kind of you. Are you sure it's not too much bother?" "Not in the least." She thanked him again and gave him her telephone number, adding with a touch of shyness, "My name is Gillian West." As he was driven through the night, bound on his errand, a curious smile came to Mr. Satterthwaite's lips. He thought, so that is all it is, the shape of a face, the curve of a jaw. But he fulfilled his promise. So the following Sunday afternoon, Mr. Satterthwaite went to Kew Gardens to admire the roaded entrance. Very long ago, incredibly long ago, it seemed to Mr. Satterthwaite, he had driven down to Kew Gardens with a certain young lady to see the Blue Bells. Mr. Satterthwaite had arranged very carefully beforehand in his own mind exactly what he was going to say, and the precise words he would use in asking the young lady for her hand in marriage. He was just conning them over in his mind and responding to her raptures about the Blue Bells a little absent-mindedly. When the shock came, the young lady stopped exclaiming at the Blue Bells and suddenly confided in Mr. Satterthwaite as a true friend her love for another. Mr. Satterthwaite put away the little set speech he had prepared and hastily rummaged for sympathy and friendship in the bottom drawer of his mind. Such was Mr. Satterthwaite's romance, a rather tepid early Victorian one, but it had left him with a romantic attachment to Kew Gardens, and he would often go there to see the Blue Bells, or if he had been abroad later than usual, the roaded entrance, and would sigh to himself and feel rather sentimental, and really enjoy himself very much indeed in an old-fashioned romantic way. This particular afternoon he was strolling back past the tea houses when he recognized a couple sitting at one of the small tables on the grass. They were Gillian, West, and the fair young man, and at that same moment they recognized him. He saw the girl flush and speak eagerly to her companion. In another minute he was shaking hands with them both in his correct, rather prim fashion, and had accepted the shy invitation proffered him to have tea with them. "I can't tell you, sir," said Mr. Burns, "how grateful I am to you for looking after Gillian the other night. She told me all about it." "Yes, indeed," said the girl. "It was ever so kind of you." Mr. Satterthwaite felt pleased and interested in the pair. Their naivete and sincerity touched. Also, it was to him a peep into a world with which he was not well acquainted. These people were of a class unknown to him. In his little dried-up way, Mr. Satterthwaite could be very sympathetic. Very soon he was hearing all about his new friends. He noted that Mr. Burns had become Charlie, and he was not unprepared for the statement that the two were engaged. "As a matter of fact," said Mr. Burns with refreshing candor, "it just happened this afternoon, didn't it, Gil?" Burns was a clerk in a shipping firm. He was making a fair salary, had a little money of his own, and the two proposed to be married quite soon. Mr. Satterthwaite listened and nodded and congratulated. An ordinary young man, he thought to himself, a very ordinary young man, nice, straightforward young chap, plenty to say for himself, good opinion of himself without being conceited, nice looking without being unduly handsome, nothing remarkable about him, and will never set the Thames on fire, and the girl loves him aloud, he said. And Mr. Eastney, he purposely broke off, but he had said enough to produce an effect for which he was not unprepared. Charlie Burns's face darkened, and Gillian looked troubled. More than troubled, he thought. She looked afraid. "I don't like it," she said in a low voice. Her words were addressed to Mr. Satterthwaite, as though she knew by instinct that he would understand a feeling incomprehensible to her lover. "You see, he's done a lot for me. He's encouraged me to take up singing and helped me with it. But I've known all the time that my voice wasn't really good. Not first class. Of course, I've had engagements." She stopped. "You've had a bit of trouble, too," said Burns. "A girl wants someone to look after her. Gillian's had a lot of unpleasantness, Mr. Satterthwaite. Altogether, she's had a lot of unpleasantness. She's a good looker, as you can see, and, well, that often leads to trouble for a girl." Between them, Mr. Satterthwaite became enlightened as to various happenings which were vaguely classed by Burns under the heading of unpleasantness. A young man who had shot himself, the extraordinary conduct of a bank manager who was a married man, a violent stranger who must have been balmy, the wild behavior of an elderly artist, a trail of violence and tragedy that Gillian West had left in her wake, recited in the commonplace tones of Charles Burns. "And it's my opinion," he ended, "that this fellow Eastney is a bit cracked. Gillian would have had trouble with him if I hadn't turned up to look after her." His laugh sounded a little fatuous to Mr. Satterthwaite, and no responsive smile came to the girl's face. She was looking earnestly at Mr. Satterthwaite. "Phil's all right," she said slowly. "He cares for me, I know, and I care for him like a friend, but not anything more. I don't know how he'll take the news about Charlie, I'm sure. I'm so afraid he'll be." She stopped, inarticulate in face of the danger she vaguely sensed. "If I can help you in any way," said Mr. Satterthwaite warmly, "pray command me." He fancied Charlie Burns looked vaguely resentful, but Gillian said at once, "Thank you." Mr. Satterthwaite left his new friends after having promised to take tea with Gillian on the following Thursday. When Thursday came, Mr. Satterthwaite felt a little thrill of pleasurable anticipation. He thought, "I'm an old man, but not too old to be thrilled by a face. Then he shook his head with a sense of foreboding. Gillian was alone. Charlie Burns was to come in later. She looked much happier, Mr. Satterthwaite thought, as though a load had been lifted from her mind. Indeed, she frankly admitted as much. "I dreaded telling Phil about Charles. It was silly of me. I ought to have known Phil better. He was upset, of course, but no one could have been sweeter. Really sweet he was. Look what he sent me this morning. A wedding present. Isn't it magnificent?" It was indeed rather magnificent for a young man in Philip Eastney's circumstances. A 4-valve wireless set of the latest type. "We both love music so much, you see," he explained the girl. Phil said that when I was listening to a concert on this, I should always think of him a little. And I'm sure I shall, because we have been such friends. You must be proud of your friend, said Mr. Satterthwaite gently. He seems to have taken the blow like a true sportsman. Jillian nodded. He saw the quick tears come into her eyes. He asked me to do one thing for him. Tonight is the anniversary of the day we first met. He asked me if I would stay at home quietly this evening and listen to the wireless program, not to go out with Charlie anywhere. I said, of course I would, and that I was very touched, and that I would think of him with a lot of gratitude and affection. Mr. Satterthwaite nodded, but he was puzzled, and he was seldom at fault in his delineation of character, and he would have judged Philip Eastney quite incapable of such a sentimental request. The young man must be of a more banal order than that, he supposed. Jillian evidently thought the idea quite in keeping with her rejected lover's character. Mr. Satterthwaite was just a little disappointed. He was sentimental himself and knew, but he expected better things of the rest of the world. Besides, sentiment belonged to his age. It had no part to play in the modern world. He asked Gillian to sing, and she complied. He told her her voice was charming, but he knew quite well in his own mind that it was distinctly second class. Any success that could have come to her in the profession she had adopted would have been won by her face, not her voice. He was not particularly anxious to see young Count Burns again, so presently he rose to go. It was at that moment that his attention was attracted by an ornament on the mantelpiece, which stood out among the other rather gimcrack objects, like a jewel on a dust heap. It was a curving beaker of thin green glass, long-stemmed and graceful, and poised on the edge of it was what looked like a gigantic soap bubble, a ball of iridescent glass. Jillian noticed his absorption. That's an extra wedding present from Phil. It's rather pretty. I think he works in a sort of glass factory. It is a beautiful thing, said Mr. Satterthwaite reverently. The glass blowers of Murano might have been proud of that. He went away with his interest in Philip Eastney strangely stimulated, an extraordinarily interesting young man. And yet, the girl with the wonderful face preferred Charlie Burns. What a strange and inscrutable universe! It had just occurred to Mr. Satterthwaite that, owing to the remarkable beauty of Gillian West, his evening with Mr. Quinn had somehow missed fire. As a rule, every meeting with that mysterious individual had resulted in some strange and unforeseen happening. It was with the hope of perhaps running against the man of mystery that Mr. Satterthwaite bent his steps towards the Alekino restaurant, where once, in the days gone by, he had met Mr. Quinn, and which Mr. Quinn had said he often frequented. Mr. Satterthwaite went from room to room at the Alekino, looking hopefully about him, but there was no sign of Mr. Quinn's dark, smiling face. There was, however, somebody else. Sitting at a small table alone was Philip Eastney. The place was crowded, and Mr. Satterthwaite took his seat opposite the young man. He felt a sudden strange sense of exaltation, as though he were caught up and made part of a shimmering pattern of events. He was in this thing, whatever it was. He knew now what Mr. Quinn had meant that evening at the opera. There was a drama going on, and in it was a part, an important part, for Mr. Satterthwaite. He must not fail to take his cue and speak his lines. He sat down opposite Philip Eastney with the sense of accomplishing the inevitable. It was easy enough to get into conversation. Eastney seemed anxious to talk. Mr. Satterthwaite was, as always, an encouraging and sympathetic listener. They talked of the war, of explosives, of poison gases. Eastney had a lot to say about these last, for during the greater part of the war he had been engaged in their jay manufacture. Mr. Satterthwaite found him really interesting. There was one gas, Eastney said, that had never been tried. The armistice had come too soon. Great things had been hoped for it. One whiff of it was deadly. He warmed to animation as he spoke. Having broken the ice, Mr. Satterthwaite gently turned the conversation to music. Eastney's thin face lit up. He spoke with the passion and abandon of the real music lover. They discussed Yoshbim, and the young man was enthusiastic. Both he and Mr. Satterthwaite agreed that nothing on earth could surpass a really fine tenor voice. Eastney, as a boy, had heard Caruso, and he had never forgotten it. "Do you know that he could sing to a wine glass and shatter it?" he demanded. "I always thought that was a fable," said Mr. Satterthwaite, smiling. "No, it's gospel truth, I believe. The thing's quite possible. It's a question of resonance. He went off into technical details. His face was flushed and his eyes shone. The subject seemed to fascinate him, and Mr. Satterthwaite noted that he seemed to have a thorough grasp of what he was talking about. The elder man realized that he was talking to an exceptional, a brain that might almost be described as that of a genius. Brilliant, erratic, undecided as yet as to the true channel to give it outlet, but undoubtedly genius. And he thought of Charlie Burns and wondered at Gillian West. It was with quite a start that he realized how late it was getting, and he called for his bill. Eastney looked slightly apologetic. "I am ashamed of myself, running on so," he said, "but it was a lucky chance sent you along here tonight. I needed someone to talk to this evening." He ended his speech with a curious little laugh. His eyes were still blazing with some subdued excitement, yet there was something tragic about him. "It has been quite a pleasure," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Our conversation has been most interesting and instructive to me." He then made his funny, courteous little bow and passed out of the restaurant. The night was a warm one, and as he walked slowly down the street, a very odd fancy came to him. He had the feeling that he was not alone, that someone was walking by his side. In vain he told himself that the idea was a delusion. It persisted. Someone was walking beside him down that dark, quiet street, someone whom he could not see. He wondered what it was that brought the figure of Mr. Quinn so clearly before his mind. He felt exactly as though Mr. Quinn were there walking beside him, and yet he had only to use his eyes to assure himself that it was not so, that he was alone. But the thought of Mr. Quinn persisted, and with it came something else, a need, an urgency of some kind, an oppressive foreboding of calamity. There was something he must do and do quickly. There was something very wrong, and it lay in his hands to put it right. So strong was the feeling that Mr. Satterthwaite forebought a fight against it. Instead, he shut his eyes and tried to bring that mental image of Mr. Quinn nearer. If he could only have asked Mr. Quinn, but even as the thought flashed through his mind, he knew it was wrong. It was never any use asking Mr. Quinn anything. The threads are all in your hands. That was the kind of thing Mr. Quinn would say. The threads of what? He analyzed his own feeling and impressions carefully. That presentiment of danger now, whom did it threaten? At once a picture rose up before his eyes, the picture of Gillian West sitting alone, listening to the wireless. Mr. Satterthwaite flung a penny to a passing newspaper boy and snatched at a paper. And he turned at once to the London radio program. Yoshbim was broadcasting tonight, he noted with interest. He was singing Salve di Mora from Faust, and afterwards a selection of his folk songs, the shepherd's song, the fish, the little deer, etc. Mr. Satterthwaite crumpled the paper together. The knowledge of what Gillian was listening to seemed to make the picture of her clearer. Sitting there alone. An odd request that of Philip Eastney's, not like the man, not like him at all. There was no sentimentality in Eastney. He was a man of violent feeling, a dangerous man perhaps. Again his thought brought up with a jerk. A dangerous man, that meant something. The threads are all in your hands. That meeting with Philip Eastney tonight, rather odd, a lucky chance, Eastney had said. Was it a chance? Or was it part of that interwoven design of which Mr. Satterthwaite had once or twice been conscious this evening? He cast his mind back. There must be something in Eastney's conversation, some clue there. There must, or else why this strange feeling of urgency? What had he talked about? Singing? War work? Caruso? Caruso? Mr. Satterthwaite's thoughts went off at a tangent. Yoshbim's voice was very nearly equal to that of Caruso. Gillian would be sitting listening to it now as it rang out, true and powerful, echoing round the room, setting glasses ringing. He caught his breath. Glasses ringing. Caruso singing to a wine glass, and the wine glass breaking. Yoshbim singing in the London studio, and in a room over a mile away the crash and tinkle of glass. Not a wine glass, a thin green glass beaker, a crystal soap bubble falling, a soap bubble that perhaps was not empty. It was at that moment that Mr. Satterthwaite, as judged by passers-by, suddenly went mad. He tore open the newspaper once more, took a brief glance at the wireless announcements, and then began to run for his life down the quiet street. At the end of it, he found a crawling taxi, and jumping into it, he yelled an address to the driver and the information that it was life or death to get there quickly. The driver, judging him mentally afflicted but rich, did his utmost. Mr. Satterthwaite lay back, his head a jumble of fragmentary thoughts, forgotten bits of science learned at school, phrases used by Eastney that night. Resonance, natural periods. If the period of the force coincides with the natural period, there was something about a suspension bridge, soldiers marching over it, and the swing of their hawk stride being the same as the period of the bridge. Eastney had studied the subject, and Eastney knew, and Eastney was a genius. At 10:45, Yoshbeam was to broadcast. It was that now? Yes, but the Faust had to come first. It was the shepherd's song, with the great shout after the year, refrain that would do what? His mind went whirling round again, to overtones, halftones. He didn't know much about these things, but Eastney knew. Pray heaven he would be in time. The taxi stopped. Mr. Satterthwaite flung himself out and raced up the stone stairs to a second floor like a young athlete. The door of the flat was ajar. He pushed it open, and the great tenor voice welcomed him. The words of the shepherd's song were familiar to him in a less unconventional setting. "Oh, shepherd, see thy horse's flowing mane." He was in time then. He burst open the sitting-room door. Jillian was sitting there in a tall chair by the fireplace. "Byra Misha's daughter is to wed today. To the wedding I must haste away." She must have thought him mad. He clutched at her, crying out something incomprehensible, and half pulled, half dragged her out till they stood upon the stairway. "To the wedding I must haste away." Yaha! A wonderful high note, full-throated, powerful, hit full in the middle, a note any singer might be proud of, and with it another sound, the faint tinkle of broken glass. A stray cat darted past them and in through the flat door. Jillian made a movement, but Mr. Satterthwaite held her back, speaking incoherently. No, it's deadly. No smell, nothing to warn you. A mere whiff, and it's all over. Nobody knows quite how deadly it would be. It's unlike anything that's ever been tried before. He was repeating the things that Philip Easter had told him over the table at dinner. Jillian stared at him uncomprehendingly. Philip Eastney drew out his watch and looked at it. It was just 11:30. For the past 3/4 of an hour he had been pacing up and down the embankment. He looked out over the Thames, and then turned to look into the face of his dinner companion. "That's odd," he said and laughed. "We seem fated to run into each other tonight." "If you call it fate," said Mr. Satterthwaite. Philip Eastney looked at him more attentively, and his own expression changed. "Yes," he said quietly. Mr. Satterthwaite went straight to the point. "I have just come from Miss West's flat." Yes, the same voice, with the same deadly quiet. "We have taken a dead cat out of it." There was silence. Then Eastney said, "Who are you?" Mr. Satterthwaite spoke for some time. He recited the whole history of events. "So you see I was in time. He ended up." He paused and added quite gently, "Have you anything to say?" He expected something, some outburst, some wild justification, but nothing came. "No," said Philip Eastney quietly, and turned on his heel and walked away. Mr. Satterthwaite looked after him till his figure was swallowed up in the gloom. In spite of himself, he had a strange fellow feeling for Eastney, the feeling of an artist for another artist, of a sentimentalist for a real lover, of a plain man for a genius. At last, he roused himself with a start and began to walk in the same direction as Eastney. A fog was beginning to come up. Presently he met a policeman who looked at him suspiciously. "Did you hear a kind of splash just now?" asked the policeman. "No," said Mr. Satterthwaite. The policeman was peering out over the river. "Another of these suicides, I expect," he grunted disconsolately. "They will do it." "I suppose," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "that they have their reasons." "Money mostly," said the policeman. "Sometimes it's a woman," he said, as he prepared to move away. "It's not always their fault, but some women cause a lot of trouble." "Some women," agreed Mr. Satterthwaite softly. When the policeman had gone on, he sat down on a seat with the fog coming up all around him, and thought about Helen of Troy, and wondered if she were a nice, ordinary woman, blessed or cursed with a wonderful face. Agatha Christie, the dead harlequin. Mr. Satterthwaite walked slowly up Bond Street, enjoying the sunshine. He was, as usual, carefully and beautifully dressed, and was bound for the Hardister Galleries, where there was an exhibition of the paintings of one Frank Bristow, a new and hitherto unknown artist, who showed signs of suddenly becoming the rage. Mr. Satterthwaite was a patron of the arts. As Mr. Satterthwaite entered the Hardister Galleries, he was greeted at once with a smile of pleased recognition. "Good morning, Mr. Satterthwaite. I thought we should see you before long." "Oh, you know Bristow's work? Fine, very fine indeed, quite unique of its kind." Mr. Satterthwaite purchased a catalog and stepped through the open archway into the long room where the artist's works were displayed. They were watercolors executed with such extraordinary technique and finish that they resembled colored etchings. Mr. Satterthwaite walked slowly round the walls, scrutinizing and, on the whole, approving. He thought that this young man deserved to arrive. Here was originality, vision, and a most severe and exacting technique. There were crudities, of course. That was only to be expected. But there was also something closely allied to genius. Mr. Satterthwaite paused before a little masterpiece representing Westminster Bridge with its crowd of buses, trams, and hurrying pedestrians. A tiny thing and wonderfully perfect. It was called, he noted, the ant heap. He passed on and quite suddenly drew in his breath with a gasp. His imagination held and riveted. The picture was called The Dead Harlequin. The forefront of it represented a floor of inlaid squares of black and white marble. In the middle of the floor lay Harlequin on his back, with his arms outstretched in his motley of black and red. Behind him was a window, and outside that window, gazing in at the figure on the floor, was what appeared to be the same man, silhouetted against the red glow of the setting sun. The picture excited Mr. Satterthwaite for 2 reasons. The first was that he recognized, or thought that he recognized, the face of the man in the picture. It bore a distinct resemblance to a certain Mr. Quinn, an acquaintance whom Mr. Satterthwaite had encountered once or twice under somewhat mystifying circumstances. "Surely I can't be mistaken," he murmured. "If it is so, what does it mean?" For it had been Mr. Satterthwaite's experience that every appearance of Mr. Quinn had some distinct significance attaching to it. There was, as already mentioned, a second reason for Mr. Satterthwaite's interest. He recognized the scene of the picture. "The terrace room at Charnley," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "curious and very interesting." He looked with more attention at the picture, wondering what exactly had been in the artist's mind. One Harlequin dead on the floor, another Harlequin looking through the window, or was it the same Harlequin? He moved slowly along the walls, gazing at other pictures with unseeing eyes, with his mind always busy on the same subject. He was excited. Life, which had seemed a little drab this morning, was drab no longer. He knew quite certainly that he was on the threshold of exciting and interesting events. He crossed to the table where sat Mr. Cobb, a dignitary of the Hardister Galleries whom he had known for many years. "I have a fancy for buying number 39, he said, "if it is not already sold." Mr. Cobb consulted a ledger. "The pick of the bunch," he murmured. "Quite a little jam, isn't it?" "No, it is not sold." He quoted a price. "It's a good investment, Mr. Satterthwaite. You will have to pay 3 times as much for it. This time next year. That is always said on these occasions," said Mr. Satterthwaite, smiling. "Well, and haven't I been right?" demanded Mr. Cobb. "I don't believe if you were to sell your collection, Mr. Satterthwaite, that a single picture would fetch less than you gave for it." "I will buy this picture," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "I will give you a check now. You won't regret. We believe in Bristow. He is a young man, 27 or 8, I should say. I should like to meet him," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Perhaps he will come and dine with me one night. I can give you his address. I am sure he would leap at the chance. Your name stands for a good deal in the artistic world." "You flatter me," said Mr. Satterthwaite, and was going on when Mr. Cobb interrupted. "Here he is now. I will introduce you to him right away." He rose from behind his table. Mr. Satterthwaite accompanied him to where a big, clumsy young man was leaning against the wall, surveying the world at large from behind the barricade of a ferocious scowl. Mr. Cobb made the necessary introductions, and Mr. Satterthwaite made a formal and gracious little speech. "I have just had the pleasure of acquiring one of your pictures, The Dead Harlequin." "Oh, well, you won't lose by it," said Mr. Bristow ungraciously. "It's a bit of half-damned good work. Although I say it, I can see that," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Your work interests me very much, Mr. Bristow. It is extraordinarily mature for so young a man. I wonder if you would ever give me the pleasure of dining with me one night. Are you engaged this evening?" "As a matter of fact, I am not," said Mr. Bristow, still with no overdone appearance of graciousness. "Then shall we say 8 o'clock?" said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Here is my card with the address on it." "Oh, all right," said Mr. Bristow. "Thanks," he added as a somewhat obvious afterthought. "A young man who has a poor opinion of himself and is afraid that the world should share it." Such was Mr. Satterthwaite's summing up as he stepped out into the sunshine of Bond Street, and Mr. Satterthwaite's judgment of his fellow men was seldom far astray. Frank Bristow arrived about 5 minutes past 8 to find his host and a third guest awaiting him. The other guest was introduced as a Colonel Monckton. They went into dinner almost immediately. There was a fourth place laid at the oval mahogany table, and Mr. Satterthwaite uttered a word of explanation. "I half expected my friend Mr. Quinn might drop in," he said. "I wonder if you have ever met him." "Mr. Harley, eh, Quinn? I never meet people," growled Bristow. Colonel Monckton stared at the artist with the detached interest he might have accorded to a new species of jellyfish. Mr. Satterthwaite exerted himself to keep the ball of conversation rolling amicably. "I took a special interest in that picture of yours because I thought I recognized the scene of it as being the terrace room at Charlie. Was I right?" As the artist nodded, he went on. "That is very interesting. I have stayed at Charlie several times myself in the past. Perhaps you know some of the family?" "No, I don't," said Bristow. "That sort of family wouldn't care to know me. I went there in a char-a-banc." "Dear me," said Colonel Monckton for the sake of saying something. "In a char-a-banc, dear me." Frank Bristow scowled at him. "Why not?" he demanded ferociously. Poor Colonel Monckton was taken aback. He looked reproachfully at Mr. Satterthwaite as though to say, "These primitive forms of life may be interesting to you as a naturalist, but why drag me in?" "Oh, beastly things, char-a-bancs," he said. "They jolt you so going over the bumps."
"If you can't afford a Rolls-Royce, you have got to go in char-a-bancs," said Bristow fiercely.
Colonel Monckton stared at him, Mr. Satterthwaite thought. "Unless I can manage to put this young man at his ease, we are going to have a very distressing evening." "Charlie always fascinated me," he said. "I have been there only once since the tragedy. A grim house? And a ghostly one, that's true," said Bristow. "There are actually 2 authentic ghosts," said Monckton. "They say that Charles Levi walks up and down the terrace with his head under his arm. I have forgotten why, I'm sure. Then there is the weeping lady with the silver ewer, who is always seen after one of the Charlies dies." "Tosh," said Bristow scornfully. "They have certainly been a very ill-fated family," said Mr. Satterthwaite hurriedly. 4 holders of the title have died a violent death, and the late Lord Charlie committed suicide." "A ghastly business," said Monckton gravely. "I was there when it happened." "Let me see. That must be 14 years ago," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "The house has been shut up ever since." "I don't wonder at that," said Monckton. "It must have been a terrible shock for a young girl." They had been married a month, just home from their honeymoon. Big fancy dress ball to celebrate their homecoming. Just as the guests were starting to arrive, Charlie locked himself into the oak parlor and shot himself. That sort of thing isn't done. "I beg your pardon?" He turned his head sharply to the left and looked across at Mr. Satterthwaite with an apologetic laugh. "I am beginning to get the jim-jams. Satterthwaite, I thought for a moment there was someone sitting in that empty chair and that he said something to me. Yes," he went on after a minute or two, "it was a pretty ghastly shock to Alex Charnley. She was one of the prettiest girls you could see anywhere and cram full of what people call the joy of living. And now they say she is like a ghost. Herself, not that I have seen her for years. I believe she lives abroad most of the time. And the boy? The boy is at Eton. What he will do when he comes of age, I don't know. I don't think somehow that he will reopen the old place. It would make a good people's pleasure park," said Bristow. Colonel Monckton looked at him with cold abhorrence. "No, no, you don't really mean that," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "You wouldn't have painted that a picture if you did. Tradition and atmosphere are intangible things. They take centuries to build up, and if you destroyed them, you couldn't rebuild them again in 24 hours. He rose. "Let us go into the smoking room. I have some photographs there of Charnley, which I should like to show you. One of Mr. Satterthwaite's hobbies was amateur photography. He was also the proud author of a book, Homes of My Friends." The friends in question were all rather exalted, and the book itself showed Mr. Satterthwaite forth in rather a more snobbish light than was really fair to him. "That is a photograph I took of the terrace room last year," he said. He handed it to Bristow. "You see, it is taken at almost the same angle as is shown in your picture. That is rather a wonderful rug. It is a pity that photographs can't show coloring." "I remember it," said Bristow, "a marvelous bit of color. It glowed like a flame. All the same, it looked a bit incongruous there. The wrong size for that big room with its black and white squares. There is no rug anywhere else in the room. It spoils the whole effect. It was like a gigantic bloodstain. Perhaps that gave you your idea for your picture?" said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Perhaps it did," said Bristow thoughtfully. "On the face of it, one would naturally stage a tragedy in the little paneled room leading out of it." "The oak parlor," said Monkton. "Yes, that is the haunted room right enough. There is a priest's hiding hole there, a movable panel by the fireplace. Tradition has it that Charles the Furland was concealed there once. There were 2 deaths from dueling in that room, and it was there, as I say, that Reggie Charnley shot himself." He took the photograph from Bristow's hand. "Why, that is the Bokhara rug," he said, "worth a couple of £1,000, I believe. When I was there it was in the oak parlor, the right place for it. It looked silly on that great expanse of marble flags." Mr. Satterthwaite was looking at the empty chair which he had drawn up beside his. Then he said thoughtfully, "I wonder when it was moved. It must have been recently." "Why, I remember having a conversation about it on the very day of the tragedy. Charnley was saying it really ought to be kept under glass." Mr. Satterthwaite shook his head. "The house was shut up immediately after the tragedy, and everything was left exactly as it was." Bristow broke in with a question. He had laid aside his aggressive manner. "Why did Lord Charnley shoot himself?" he asked. Colonel Monckton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "No one ever knew," he said vaguely. "I suppose," said Mr. Satterthwaite slowly, "that it was suicide." The colonel looked at him in blank astonishment. "Suicide," he said. "Why, of course it was suicide. My dear fellow, I was there in the house myself." Mr. Satterthwaite looked towards the empty chair at his side, and smiling to himself as though at some hidden joke the others could not see, he said quietly, "Sometimes one sees things more clearly years afterwards than one could possibly at the time." "Nonsense," spluttered Monckton. "Aren't nonsense. How can you possibly see things better when they are vague in your memory instead of clear and sharp?" But Mr. Satterthwaite was reinforced from an unexpected quarter. "I know what you mean," said the artist. "I should say that, possibly, you were right. It is a question of proportion, isn't it? And more than proportion, probably. Relativity and all that sort of thing. If you ask me," said the colonel, "all this Einstein business is a lot of dashed nonsense." "So are spiritualists and the spook of one's grandmother?" He glared round fiercely. "Of course it was suicide," he went on. "Didn't I practically see the thing happen with my own eyes?" "Tell us about it," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "so that we shall see it with our eyes also." With a somewhat mollified grunt, the colonel settled himself more comfortably in his chair. "The whole thing was extraordinarily unexpected," he began. "Charlie had been his usual normal self. There was a big party staying in the house for this ball. No one could ever have guessed he would go and shoot himself just as the guests began arriving. It would have been better taste if he had waited until they had gone," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Of course it would. Damned bad taste to do a thing like that. Uncharacteristic," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Yes," admitted Monckton, "it wasn't like Charlie, and yet it was suicide? Of course it was suicide. Why, there were 3 or 4 of us there at the top of the stairs. Myself, the Ostrander girl, Algidasi, and 1 or 2 others. Charlie passed along the hall below and went into the oak parlor. The Ostrander girl said there was a ghastly look on his face, and his eyes were staring, but of course that is nonsense. She couldn't even see his face from where we were. But he did walk in a hunched way, as if he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. One of the girls called to him. She was somebody's governess, I think, whom Lady Charlie had included in the party out of kindness. She was looking for him with a message. She called out, 'Lord Charlie, Lady Charlie wants to know.' He paid no attention and went into the oak parlor and slammed the door, and we heard the key turn in the lock. Then 1 minute after, we heard the shot. We rushed down to the hall. There is another door from the oak parlor leading into the terrace room. We tried that, but it was locked too. In the end, we had to break the door down. Charlie was lying on the floor, dead, with a pistol close beside his right hand. Now, what could that have been but suicide? Accident? Don't tell me. There is only one other possibility: murder. And you can't have murder without a murderer. You admit that, I suppose? The murderer might have escaped, suggested Mr. Satterthwaite. That is impossible. If you have a bit of paper and a pencil, I will draw you a plan of the place. There are 2 doors into the oak parlor, one into the hall and one into the terrace room. Both these doors were locked in the inside, and the keys were in the locks. The window shut, and the shutters fastened across it. There was a pause. "So that is that," said Colonel Monckton triumphantly. "It certainly seems to be," said Mr. Satterthwaite sadly. "Mind you," said the colonel, "although I was laughing just now at the spiritualists, I don't mind admitting that there was a deuced rummy atmosphere about the place, about that room in particular. There are several bullet holes in the panels of the walls, the results of the duels that took place in that room, and there is a queer stain on the floor that always comes back, though they have replaced the wood several times. I suppose there will be another blood stain on the floor now. Poor Charlie's blood." "Was there much blood?" asked Mr. Satterthwaite. "Very little, curiously little, so the doctor said." "Where did he shoot himself through the head?" "No, through the heart." "That is not the easy way to do it," said Bristow. "Frightfully difficult to know where one's heart is. I should never do it that way myself." Mr. Satterthwaite shook his head. He was vaguely dissatisfied. He had hoped to get at something. He hardly knew what. Colonel Monckton went on, "It is a spooky place, Charlie. Of course I didn't see anything." "You didn't see the weeping lady with the silver ewer?" "No, I did not, sir," said the colonel emphatically, "but I expect every servant in the place swore they did." "Superstition was the curse of the Middle Ages," said Bristow. "There are still traces of it here in town. There, but thank goodness we axe getting free from it." "Superstition," mused Mr. Satterthwaite. His eyes turned again to the empty chair. "Sometimes, don't you think? It might be useful." Bristow stared at him. "Useful. That's a queer word." "Well, I hope you are convinced now, Satterthwaite," said the colonel. "Oh, quite," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "On the face of it, it seems odd, so purposeless for a married man, young, rich, happy, celebrating his homecoming, curious. But I agree there is no getting away from the facts." He repeated softly, "the facts," and frowned. "I suppose the interesting thing is a thing we none of us will ever know," said Monckton. "The story behind it all. Of course there were rumors, all sorts of rumors. You know, the kind of things people say. But no one knew anything," said Mr. Satterthwaite thoughtfully. "It's not a bestseller mystery, is it?" remarked Bristow. "No one gained by the man's death." "No one except an unborn child," said Mr. Satterthwaite. Monckton gave a sharp chuckle. "Rather a blow to poor Hugo Charnley," he observed. "As soon as it was known that there was going to be a child, he had the graceful task of sitting tight and waiting to see if it would be a girl or boy. Rather an anxious wait for his creditors. Too. In the end a boy it was, and a disappointment for the lot of them." "Was the widow very disconsolate?" asked Bristow. "Poor child," said Monckton. "I shall never forget her. She didn't cry or break down or anything. She was like something frozen. As I say, she shut up the house shortly afterwards, and as far as I know, it has never been reopened since." "So we are left in the dark as to motive," said Bristow with a slight laugh. "Another man or another woman, it must have been one or the other, eh?" "It seems like it," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "And the betting is strongly on another woman," continued Bristow, "since the fair widow has not married again. I hate women," he added dispassionately. Mr. Satterthwaite smiled a little, and Frank Bristow saw the smile and pounced upon it. "You may smile," he said, "but I do. They upset everything, they interfere, they get between you. On your work, I only once met a woman who was, well, interesting." "I thought there would be one," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Not in the way you mean, I just met her casually." "As a matter of fact, it was in a train, after all," he added defiantly. "Why shouldn't one meet people in trains?" "Certainly, certainly," said Mr. Satterthwaite soothingly. "A train is as good a place as anywhere else." It was coming down from the north. We had the carriage to ourselves. I don't know why, but we began to talk. I don't know her name, and I don't suppose I shall ever meet her again. I don't know that I want to. It might be a pity. He paused, struggling to express himself. She wasn't quite real, you know. Shadowy, like one of the people who come out of the hills in Gaelic fairy tales. Mr. Satterthwaite nodded gently. His imagination pictured the scene easily enough. The very positive and realistic Bristow and a figure that was silvery and ghostly. Shadowy, as Bristow had said. I suppose if something very terrible had happened, so terrible as to be almost unbearable, one might get like that. One might run away from reality into a half-world of one's own. And then, of course, after a time, one wouldn't be able to get back. Was that what had happened to her? Asked Mr. Satterthwaite curiously. I don't know, said Bristow. She didn't tell me anything. I'm only guessing. One has to guess if one is going to get anywhere. Yes, said Mr. Thwaite slowly. One has to guess. He looked up as the door opened. He looked up quickly and expectantly, but the butler's words disappointed him. A lady, sir, has called to see you on very urgent business. Mr. Spacia Glen. Mr. Satterthwaite rose in some astonishment. He knew the name of Aspasia Glen. Who in London did not? First, I advertised as the woman with the scarf she had given a series of matinees single-handed that had taken London by storm. With the aid of her scarf, she had impersonated rapidly various characters. In turn, the scarf had been the coif of a nun, the shawl of a mill worker, the headdress of a peasant, and 100 other things. And in each impersonation, Aspasia Glen had been totally and utterly different. As an artist, Mr. Satterthwaite paid full reverence to her. As it happened, he had never made her acquaintance. A call upon him at this unusual hour intrigued him greatly. With a few words of apology to the others, he left the room and crossed the hall to the drawing-room. Miss Glen was sitting in the very center of a large settee upholstered in gold brocade. So poised, she dominated the room. Mr. Satterthwaite perceived at once that she meant to dominate the situation. Curiously enough, his first feeling was one of repulsion. He had been a sincere admirer of Aspasia Glen's art. Her personality, as conveyed to him over the footlights, had been appealing and sympathetic. Her effects there had been wistful and suggestive rather than commanding. But now, face to face with the woman herself, he received a totally different impression. There was something hard, bold, forceful about her. She was tall and dark, possibly about 35 years of age. She was undoubtedly very good-looking, and she clearly relied upon the fact. "You must forgive this unconventional call, Mr. Satterthwaite," she said. Her voice was full and rich and seductive. "I won't say that I have wanted to know you for a long time, but I am glad of the excuse. As for coming tonight," she laughed, "well, when I want a thing, I simply can't wait. When I want a thing, I simply must have it. Any excuse that has brought me such a charming lady guest must be welcomed by me," said Mr. Satterthwaite in an old-fashioned, gallant manner. "How nice you are to me," said Aspasia Glen. "My dear lady," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "may I thank you here and now for the pleasure you have so often given me, in my seat in the stalls." She smiled delightfully at him. "I am coming straight to the point. I was at the heartiest of galleries today. I saw a picture there I simply couldn't live without. I wanted to buy it, and I couldn't, because you had already bought it." So she paused. "I do want it so," she went on. "Dear Mr. Satterthwaite, I simply must have it. I brought my checkbook." She looked at him hopefully. "Everyone tells me you are so frightfully kind. People are kind to me, you know. It is very bad for me. But there it is." So these were Aspasia Glen's methods. Mr. Satterthwaite was inwardly coldly critical of this ultra-femininity and of this spoiled child pose. It ought to appeal to him, he supposed, but it didn't. Aspasia Glen had made a mistake. She had judged him as an elderly dilettante, easily flattered by a pretty woman. But Mr. Satterthwaite, behind his gallant manner, had a shrewd and critical mind. He saw people pretty well as they were, not as they wished to appear to him. He saw before him, not a charming woman pleading for a whim, but a ruthless egoist determined to get her own way for some reason, which was obscure to him. And he knew quite certainly that Aspasia Glen was not going to get her own way. He was not going to give up the picture of the dead harlequin to her. He sought rapidly in his mind for the best way of circumventing her without overt rudeness. "I am sure," he said, "that everyone gives you your own way as often as they can, and is only too delighted to do so. Then you are really going to let me have the picture." Mr. Satterthwaite shook his head slowly and regretfully. "I am afraid that is impossible." You see, he paused. I bought that picture for a lady. It is a present. Oh, but surely. The telephone on the table rang sharply. With a murmured word of excuse, Mr. Satterthwaite took up the receiver. A voice spoke to him, a small, cold voice that sounded very far away. Can I speak to Mr. Satterthwaite, please? It is Mr. Satterthwaite speaking. I am Lady Charnley, Alex Charnley. I dare say you don't remember me, Mr. Satterthwaite. It is a great many years since we met. My dear Alex, of course I remember you. There is something I wanted to ask you. I was at the Hardister Galleries at an exhibition of pictures today. There was one called The Dead Harlequin. Perhaps you recognized it. It was the terrace room at Charnley. I want to have that picture. It was sold to you. She paused. Mr. Satterthwaite, for reasons of my own, I want that picture. Will you resell it to me? Mr. Satterthwaite thought to himself, why, this is a miracle. As he spoke into the receiver, he was thankful that Aspasia Glen could only hear one side of the conversation. If you will accept my gift, dear lady, it will make me very happy. He heard a sharp exclamation behind him and hurried on. I bought it for you. I did indeed. But listen, my dear Alex, I want to ask you to do me a great favor, if you will. Of course, Mr. Satterthwaite, I am so very grateful. He went on. I want you to come round now to my house at once. There was a slight pause, and then she answered quietly, I will come at once. Mr. Satterthwaite put down the receiver and turned to Miss Glen. She said quickly and angrily, that was the picture you were talking about? Yes, said Mr. Satterthwaite. The lady to whom I am presenting it is coming round to this house in a few minutes. Suddenly, Aspasia Glen's face broke once more into smiles. You will give me a chance of persuading her to turn the picture over to me. I will give you a chance of persuading her. Inwardly, he was strangely excited. He was in the midst of a drama that was shaping itself to some foredoomed end. He, the looker-on, was playing a star part. He turned to Miss Glen. Will you come into the other room with me? I should like you to meet some friends of mine. He held the door open for her, and crossing the hall, opened the door of the smoking room. Miss Glen, he said, let me introduce you to an old friend of mine, Colonel Monckton, Mr. Bristow, the painter of the picture you admire so much. Then he started as a third figure rose from the chair which he had left empty beside his own. I think you expected me this evening, said Mr. Quinn. During your absence, I introduced myself to your friends. I am so glad I was able to drop in. My dear friend, said Mr. Satterthwaite, I have been carrying on as well as I am able, but he stopped before the slightly sardonic glance of Mr. Quinn's dark eyes. Let me introduce you, Mr. Harley Quinn, Mrs. Aspasia Glen. Was it fancy, or did she shrink back slightly? A curious expression flitted over her face. Suddenly Bristow broke in boisterously. I have got it. Got what? Got hold of what was puzzling me. There is a likeness. There is a distinct likeness. He was staring curiously at Mr. Quinn. You see it? He turned to Mr. Satterthwaite. Don't you see a distinct likeness to the Harlequin of my picture? The man looking in through the window? It was no fancy this time. He distinctly heard Miss Glen draw in her breath sharply, and even saw that she stepped back one pace. I told you that I was expecting someone, said Mr. Satterthwaite. He spoke with an air of triumph. I must tell you that my friend Mr. Quinn is a most extraordinary person. He can unravel mysteries. He can make you see things. Are you a medium, sir? Demanded Colonel Monckton, eyeing Mr. Quinn, doubtfully. The latter smiled and slowly shook his head. Mr. Satterthwaite exaggerates, he said quietly. Once or twice when I have been with him, he has done some extraordinary good deductive work. Why he puts the credit down to me, I can't say. His modesty, I suppose? No, said Mr. Satterthwaite excitedly. It isn't. You make me see things that I ought to have seen all along, that I actually have seen, but without knowing that I saw them. It sounds to me deuced complicated, said Colonel Monckton. Not really, said Mr. Quinn. The trouble is that we are not content just to see things. We will tack the wrong interpretation onto the things we see. Aspasia Glen turned to Frank Bristow. I want to know, she said nervously, what put the idea of painting that picture into your head? Bristow shrugged his shoulders. I don't quite know, he confessed. Something about the place, about Charlie, took hold of my imagination. The big empty room, the terrace outside, the idea of ghosts and things, I suppose. I have just been hearing the tale of the last Lord Charlie who shot himself. Supposing you are dead and your spirit lives on. It must be odd, you know. You might stand outside on the terrace looking in at the window at your own dead body, and you would see everything. What do you mean? Said Aspasia Glen. See everything? Well, you would see what happened. You would see... The door opened, and the butler announced Lady Charlie. Mr. Satterthwaite went to meet her. He had not seen her for nearly 13 years. He remembered her as she once was, an eager, glowing girl, and now he saw a frozen lady, very fair, very pale, with an air of drifting rather than walking, a snowflake driven at random by an icy breeze, something unreal about her, so cold, so far away. "It was very good of you to come," said Mr. Satterthwaite. He led her forward. She made a half gesture of recognition towards Miss Glen, and then paused as the other made no response. "I am so sorry," she murmured, "but surely I have met you somewhere, haven't I?" "Over the footlights, perhaps," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "This is Mr. Aspasia Glen, Lady Charlie." "I am very pleased to meet you, Lady Charlie," said Aspasia Glen. Her voice had suddenly a slight transatlantic tinge to it. Mr. Satterthwaite was reminded of one of her various stage impersonations. "Colonel Monckton, you know," continued Mr. Satterthwaite, "and this is Mr. Bristow." He saw a sudden faint tinge of color in her cheeks. "Mr. Bristow and I have met too," she said, and smiled a little, "in a train, and Mr. Harley Quinn." He watched her closely, but this time there was no flicker of recognition. He set a chair for her, and then, seating himself, he cleared his throat and spoke a little nervously. This is rather an unusual little gathering. It sent us round this picture. I think that if we liked, we could clear things up." "You are not going to hold a stance, Satterthwaite?" asked Colonel Monckton. "You are very odd this evening." "No," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "not exactly a seance, but my friend Mr. Quinn believes, and I agree that one can, by looking back over the past, see things as they were, and not as they appeared to be." "The past," said Lady Charlie. "I am speaking of your husband's suicide, Alex. I know it hurts you." "No," said Alex Charlie, "it doesn't hurt me. Nothing hurts me now." Mr. Satterthwaite thought of Frank Bristow's words. She was not quite real, you know. Shadowy, like one of those people who come out of hills in Gaelic fairy tales. Shadowy, he had called her. That described her exactly. A shadow, a reflection of something else. Where then was the real Alex? And his mind answered quickly. "In the past, divided from us by 14 years of time. My dear," he said, "you frighten me. You are like the weeping lady with the silver, you are." Crash! The coffee cup on the table by Aspasia's elbow fell shattered to the floor. Mr. Satterthwaite waved aside her apologies. He thought, "We are getting nearer. We are getting nearer every minute." But nearer to what? Let us take our minds back to that night 14 years ago. Lord Charlie killed himself. For what reason? No one knows. Lady Charlie stirred slightly in her chair. "Lady Charlie knows," said Frank Bristow abruptly. "Nonsense," said Colonel Monckton, then stopped, frowning at her curiously. She was looking across at the artist. It was as though he drew the words out of her. She spoke, nodding her head slowly, and her voice was like a snowflake, cold and soft. "Yes, you're quite right, I know. That is why, as big as I live, I can never go back to Charlie. That is why, when my boy Dick wants me to open the place up and live there again, I tell him it can't be done." "Will you tell us the reason, Lady Charlie?" said Mr. Quinn. She looked at him. Then, as though hypnotized, she spoke as quietly and naturally as a child. "I will tell you if you like. Nothing seems to matter very much now. I found a letter among his papers, and I destroyed it." "What letter?" said Mr. Quinn. "The letter from the girl, from that poor child. She was the Miriam's nursery governess. He had made love to her. Yes, while he was engaged to me just before we were married. And she was going to have a child too. She wrote saying so, and that she was going to tell me about it. So you see, he shot himself." She looked round at them wearily and dreamily, like a child who has repeated a lesson it knows too well. "Colonel Monckton blew his nose, my God," he said. "So that was it." "Well, that explains things with a vengeance, does it?" said Mr. Satterthwaite. "It doesn't explain one thing. It doesn't explain why Mr. Bristow painted that picture." "What do you mean?" Mr. Satterthwaite looked across at Mr. Quinn as though for encouragement, and apparently got it, for he proceeded. "Yes, I know I sound mad to all of you, but that picture is the focus of the whole thing. We are all here tonight because of that picture. That picture had to be painted. That is what I mean." "You mean the uncanny influence of the oak parlor," began Colonel Monckton. "No," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "not the oak parlor, the terrace room. That is it. the spirit of the dead man standing outside the window and looking in and seeing his own dead body on the floor, which he couldn't have done, said the colonel, because the body was in the oak parlor. Supposing it wasn't, said Mr. Satterthwaite. Supposing it was exactly where Mr. Bristow saw it? Saw it imaginatively, on the black and white flags in front of the window. You are talking nonsense, said Colonel Monckton. If it was there, we shouldn't have found it in the oak parlor. Not unless someone carried it there, said Mr. Satterthwaite. Aye, and in that case, how could we have seen Charlie going in at the door of the oak parlor? Inquired Colonel Monckton. Well, you didn't see his face, did you? Asked Mr. Satterthwaite. What I mean is, you saw a man going into the oak parlor in fancy dress, I suppose. Brocade things and a wig, said Monckton. Just so, and you thought it was Lord Charlie because the girl called out to him as Lord Charlie. And because when we broke in a few minutes later, there was only Lord Charlie there dead, you can't get away from that, Satterthwaite. No, said Mr. Satterthwaite, discouraged. No, unless there was a hiding place of some kind. Weren't you saying something about there being a priest's hole in that room? Put in Frank Bristow? Oh, cried Mr. Satterthwaite, supposing? He waved a hand for silence and sheltered his forehead with his other hand, and then spoke, slowly and hesitatingly. I have got an idea. It may be just an idea, but I think it hangs together. Supposing someone shot Lord Charlie, shot him in the terrace room, then he and another person dragged the body into the oak parlor. They laid it down there with the pistol by its right hand. Now we go on to the next step. It must seem absolutely certain Lord Charlie has committed suicide. I think that could be done very easily. The man in his brocade and wig passes along the hall by the oak parlor door, and someone, to make sure of things, calls out to him as Lord Charlie from the top of the stairs. He goes in and locks both doors and fires a shot into the woodwork. There were bullet holes already in that room, if you remember. One more wouldn't be noticed. He then hides quietly in the secret chamber. The doors are broken open and people rush in. It seems certain that Lord Charlie has committed suicide. No other hypothesis is even entertained. Well, I think that is balderdash, said Colonel Monckton. You forget that Charlie had a motive right enough for suicide. A letter found afterwards, said Mr. Satterthwaite. A lying, cruel letter written by a very clever and unscrupulous little actress, who meant one day to be Lady Charlie herself. You mean? I mean the girl in league with Hugo Charlie, said Mr. Satterthwaite. You know, Monckton, everyone knows that that man was a blackguard. He thought that he was certain to come into the title. He turned sharply to Lady Charlie. What was the name of the girl who wrote that letter? Monica Ford, said Lady Charlie. Was it Monica Ford, Monckton, who called out to Lord Charlie from the top of the stairs? Yes. Now you come to speak of it, I believe it was. Oh, that's impossible, said Lady Charlie. I went to her about it. She told me it was all true. I only saw her once afterwards, but surely she couldn't have been acting the whole time. Mr. Satterthwaite looked across the room at Espoussia Glen. I think she could, he said quietly. I think she had in her the makings of a very accomplished actress. There is one thing you haven't got over, said Frank Bristow. There would be blood on the floor of the terrace room bound to be. They couldn't clear that up in a hurry. No, admitted Mr. Satterthwaite, but there is one thing a second or the Baccara rug. Nobody ever saw the Baccara rug in the terrace room before that night. I believe you are right, said Monckton, but all the same, those bloodstains would have to be cleared up some time. Yes, said Mr. Satterthwaite. In the middle of the night, a woman with a jug and basin could go down the stairs and clear up the bloodstains quite easily. But supposing someone saw her? It wouldn't matter, said Mr. Satterthwaite. I am speaking now of things as they are. I said a woman with a jug and basin, but if I had said a weeping lady with a silver and oar, that is what they would have appeared to be. He got up and went across to Espoussia Glen. That is what you did, wasn't it? He said. They call you the woman with the scarf now. But it was that night you played your first part, the weeping lady with the silver ewer. That is why you knocked the coffee cup off that table just now. You were afraid when you saw that picture. You thought someone knew. Lady Charlie stretched out a white, accusing hand. Monica Foward, she breathed. I recognize you now. Espoussia Glen sprang to her feet with a cry. She pushed little Mr. Satterthwaite aside with a shove of the hand and stood shaking in front of Mr. Quinn. So I was right. Someone did know. Oh, I haven't been deceived by this tomfoolery, this pretense of working things out. She pointed at Mr. Quinn. You were there. You were there outside the window looking in. You saw what we did, Hugo and I. I knew there was someone looking in. I felt it all the time, and yet when I looked up, there was nobody there. I knew someone was watching us. I thought once I caught a glimpse of a face at the window. It has frightened me all these years. And then I saw that picture with you standing at the window, and I recognized your face. You have known all these years. Why did you break silence now? That is what I want to know. Perhaps so that the dead may rest in peace, said Mr. Quinn. Suddenly, Aspasia Glenn made a rush for the door and stood there flinging a few defiant words over her shoulder. Do what you like. God knows there are witnesses enough to what I have been saying. I don't care. I don't care. I loved Hugo and I helped him with the ghastly business and he chucked me afterwards. He died last year. You can set the police on my tracks if you like, but as that little dried-up fellow there said, I am a pretty good actress. They will find it. Hard to find me. She crashed the door behind her, and a moment later they heard the slam of the front. Dolso, Reggie, cried Lady Charlie. Reggie? The tears were streaming down her face. Oh, my dear, I can go back to Charlie now. I can live there with Dickie. I can tell him what his father was, the finest, the most splendid man in all the world. We must consult very seriously as to what must be done in the matter, said Colonel Monckton. Alex, my dear, if you will let me take you home, I shall be glad to have a few words with you on the subject. Lady Charlie rose. She came across to Mr. Satterthwaite, and laying both hands on his shoulders, she kissed him very gently. It is so wonderful to be alive again after being so long dead, she said. It was like being dead, you know. Thank you, dear Mr. Satterthwaite. She went out of the room with Colonel Monckton. Mr. Satterthwaite gazed after them. A grunt from town, Frank Bristow, whom he had forgotten, made him turn sharply round. She is a lovely creature, said Bristow moodily, but she is not nearly so interesting as she was, he said gloomily. There speaks the artist, said Mr. Satterthwaite. Well, she isn't, said Mr. Bristow. I suppose I should only get the cold shoulder if I ever went butting in at Charlie. I don't want to go where I am not wanted. My dear young man, said Mr. Satterthwaite, if you will think a little less of the impression you are making on other people, you will, I think, be wiser and happier. You would also do well to disabuse your mind of some very old-fashioned notions, one of which is that birth has any significance at all in our modern conditions. You are one of those large-proportioned young men whom women always consider good-looking, and you have possibly, if not certainly, genius. Just say that over to yourself 10 times before you go to bed every night, and in 3 months I'm going to call on Lady Charlie at Charlie. That is my advice to you, and I am an old man, with considerable experience of the world. A very charming smile suddenly spread over the artist's down face. You have been thunderingly good to me, he said suddenly. He seized Mr. Satterthwaite's hand and wrung it in a powerful grip. I am no end grateful. I must be off now. Thanks very much for one of the most extraordinary evenings I have ever spent. He looked round as though to say good-bye to someone else, and then started. I say, sir, your friend is gone. I never saw him go. He is rather a queer bird, isn't he? He goes and comes very suddenly, said Mr. Satterthwaite. That is one of his characteristics. One doesn't. I always see him come and go. Like Harlequin, said Frank Bristow, he is invisible, and laughed heartily at his own joke. Agatha Christie, the bird with the broken wing. Mr. Satterthwaite looked out of the window. It was raining steadily. He shivered. Very few country houses, he reflected, were really properly heated. It cheered him to think that in a few hours' time he would be speeding towards London. Once one had passed 60 years of age, London was really much the best place. And he was feeling a little old and pathetic. Most of the members of the house party were so young. 4 of them had just gone off into the library to do table turning. They had invited him to accompany them, but he had declined. He failed to derive any amusement from the monotonous counting of the letters of the alphabet and the usual, meaningless jumble of letters that resulted. Yes, London was the best place for him. He was glad that he had declined Madge Keeley's invitation when she had rung up to invite him over to Ladell half an hour ago. An adorable young person, certainly, but London was best. Mr. Satterthwaite shivered again, and remembered that the fire in the library was usually a good one. He opened the door and adventured cautiously into the darkened room. If I'm not in the way. Was that N or M? We shall have to count again. No, of course not, Mr. Satterthwaite. Do you know the most exciting things have been happening? The spirit says her name is Ada Spears, and John here is going to marry someone called Gladys Bunn almost immediately. Mr. Satterthwaite sat down in a big, easy chair in front of the fire. His eyelids drooped over his eyes and he dozed. From time to time he returned to consciousness, hearing fragments of speech. It can't be Pabzl, not unless he's a Russian. John, you're shoving. I saw you. I believe it's a new spirit come. Another interval of dozing. Then a name jerked him wide awake. Quin, is that right? Yes, it's rapped once for yes. Quinn, have you a message for someone here? Yes, for me? For John, for Sarah, for Evelyn? No, but there's no one else. Oh, it's for Mr. Satterthwaite, perhaps. It says yes. Mr. Satterthwaite, it's a message for you. What does it say? Mr. Satterthwaite was broad awake now, sitting taut and erect in his chair, his eyes shining. The table rocked, and one of the girls counted. L-A-I, it can't be. That doesn't make sense. No word begins L-A-I. Go on, said Mr. Satterthwaite, and the command in his voice was so sharp that he was obeyed without question. L-A-D-L-A and another L-O, that seems to be all. Go on, tell us some more, please. A pause. There doesn't seem to be any more. The table's gone quite dead. How silly. No, said Mr. Satterthwaite thoughtfully. I don't think it's silly. He rose and left the room. Well, he went straight to the telephone. Presently he was through. Can I speak to Miss Keeley? Is that you, Madge, my dear? I want to change my mind, if I may, and accept your kind invitation. It is not so urgent as I thought that I should get back to town. Yes, I will arrive in time. For dinner. He hung up the receiver, a strange flush on his withered cheeks. Mr. Quinn the Dap, mysterious Mr. Harley Quinn. Mr. Satterthwaite counted over on his fingers the times he had been brought into contact with that man of mystery. Where Mr. Quinn was concerned, things happened. What had happened or was going to happen at Lydell? Whatever it was, there was work for him, Mr. Satterthwaite, to do. In some way or other, he would have an active part to play. He was sure of that. Lydell was a large house. Its owner, David Keeley, was one of those quiet men with indeterminate personalities who seemed to count as part of the furniture. Their inconspicuousness has nothing to do with brain power. David Keeley was a most brilliant mathematician and had written a book totally incomprehensible to 99/100ths of humanity. But like so many men of brilliant intellect, he radiated no bodily vigor or magnetism. It was a standing joke that David Keeley was a real invisible man. Footmen passed him by with the vegetables, and guests forgot to say goodbye. His daughter Madge was very different, a fine, upstanding young woman bursting with energy and life, thorough, healthy, and normal, and extremely pretty. It was she who received Mr. Satterthwaite when he arrived. How nice of you to come, after all. Very delightful of you to let me change my mind. Madge, my dear, you're looking very well. Oh, I'm always well. Yes, I know, but it's more than that. You look, well, blooming is the word I have in mind. Has anything happened, my dear? Anything, well, special? She laughed, blushed a little. It's too bad, Mr. Satterthwaite. You always guess things. He took her hand. So it's that, is it? Mr. Wright has come along? It was an old-fashioned term, but Madge did not object to it. She rather liked Mr. Satterthwaite's old-fashioned ways. I suppose so? Yes, but nobody's supposed to know. It's a secret. But I don't really mind your knowing, Mr. Satterthwaite. You're always so nice and sympathetic. Mr. Satterthwaite thoroughly enjoyed romance at second hand. He was sentimental and Victorian. I mustn't ask who the lucky man is. Well, then, all I can say is that I hope he is worthy of the day honor you are conferring on him. Rather a duck, old Mr. Satterthwaite, thought Madge. Oh, we shall get on awfully well together, I think. She said, you see, we like doing the same things. And that's so awfully important, isn't it? We've really got a lot in common, and we know all about each other and all that. It's really been coming on for a long time. That gives one such a nice, safe feeling, doesn't it? Undoubtedly, said Mr. Satterthwaite, but in my experience one can never really know all about anyone else. That is part of the interest and charm of life. Oh, ill risk it, said Madge, laughing, and they went up to dress for dinner. Mr. Satterthwaite was late? He had not brought a valet, and having his things unpacked for him by a stranger always flurried him a little. He came down to find everyone assembled. And in the modern style, Madge merely said, "Oh, here's Mr. Satterthwaite. I'm starving. Let's go in." She led the way with a tall, gray-haired woman, a woman of striking personality. She had a very clear, rather incisive voice, and her face was clear-cut and rather beautiful. "How do you do, Satterthwaite?" said Mr. Satterthwaite. Jumped. "How do you do?" He said, "I'm afraid I didn't see you." "Nobody does," said Mr. Keeley sadly. They went in. The table was a low oval of mahogany. Mr. Satterthwaite was placed between his young hostess and a short, dark girl, a very hearty girl with a loud voice and a ringing, determined laugh that expressed more the determination to be cheerful at all costs than any real mirth. Her name seemed to be Doris, and she was the type of young woman Mr. Satterthwaite most disliked. She had, he considered, no artistic justification for existence. On Madge's other side was a man of about 30, whose likeness to the gray-haired woman proclaimed the mother and son. Next to him, Mr. Satterthwaite caught his breath. He didn't know what it was. Exactly. It was not beauty. It was something else, something much more elusive and intangible than beauty. She was listening to Mr. Keeley's rather ponderous dinner-table conversation. Her head bent a little sideways. She was there, it seemed to Mr. Satterthwaite, and yet she was not there. She was somehow a great deal less substantial than anyone else, seated round the oval table. Something in the droop of her body sideways was beautiful, was more than beautiful. She looked up. Her eyes met Mr. Satterthwaite's for a moment across the table, and the word he wanted leapt to his mind. Enchantment, that was it. She had the quality of enchantment. She might have been one of those creatures who were only half human, one of the gaunt, hidden people from the hollow hills. She made everyone else look rather too real, but at the same time, in a queer way, she stirred his pity. It was as though semi-humanity handicapped her. He sought for a phrase and found it. "A bird with a broken wing," said Mr. Satterthwaite. Satisfied, he turned his mind back to the subject of girl guides and hoped that the girl Doris had not noticed his abstraction. When she turned to the man on the other side of her, a man Mr. Satterthwaite had hardly noticed. He himself turned to Marge. "Who is the lady sitting next to your father?" he asked in a low voice. "Mrs. Graham? Oh, no, you mean Mabel. Don't you know her?" Mabel Annesley. She was a Clydesley, one of the ill-fated Clydesleys. He started the ill-fated Clydesleys. He remembered. A brother had shot himself. A sister had been drowned. Another had perished in an earthquake. A queer Dombed family. This girl must be the youngest of them. His thoughts were recalled. Suddenly, Madge's hand touched his under the table. Everyone else was talking. She gave a faint inclination of her head to her left. "That's him," she murmured ungrammatically. Mr. Satterthwaite nodded quickly in comprehension. So this young Graham was the man of Madge's choice. Well, she could hardly have done better as far as appearances went, and Mr. Satterthwaite was a shrewd observer, a pleasant, likable, rather matter-of-fact young fellow. They'd make a nice pair. No nonsense about either of them. Good, healthy, sociable young folk. Lytle was run on old-fashioned lines. The ladies left the dining room first. Mr. Satterthwaite moved up to Graham and began to talk to him. His estimate of the young man was confirmed, yet there was something that struck him as being not quite true to type. Roger Graham was distraught. His mind seemed far away. His hand shook as he replaced the glass on the table. "Has got something on his mind," thought Mr. Satterthwaite acutely. "Not nearly as important as he thinks. It is, I dare say. All the same, I wonder what it is." Mr. Satterthwaite was in the habit of swallowing a couple of digestive pastilles after meals. Having neglected to bring them down with him, he went up to his room to fetch them. On his way down to the drawing-room, he passed along the long corridor on the ground floor. About halfway along it was a room known as the terrace room. As Mr. Satterthwaite looked through the open doorway in passing, he stopped short. Moonlight was streaming into the room. The latticed panes gave it a queer, rhythmic pattern. A figure was sitting on the low window-sill, drooping a little sideways and softly twanging the string of a ukulele, not in a jazz rhythm, but in a far older rhythm, the beat of fairy horses, riding on fairy hills. Mr. Satterthwaite stood fascinated. She wore a dress of dull, dark blue, chiffon, ruche, and pleated, so that it looked like the feathers of a bird. She bent over the down, an instrument crooning to it. He came into the room slowly, step by step. He was close to her when she looked up and saw him. She didn't start, he noticed, or seemed surprised. "I hope I'm not intruding," he began. "Please sit down." He sat near her on a polished oak chair. She hummed softly under her breath. "There's a lot of magic about tonight," she said. "Don't you think so?" Yes, there was a lot of magic about. "They wanted me to fetch my yucca," she explained, "and as I passed here I thought it would be so lovely to be alone here, in the dark and the moon. Then Mr. Satterthwaite half rose, but she stopped him. "Don't go, you fit in somehow. It's queer, but you do." He sat down again. "But it's been a queer sort of evening," she said. "I was out in the woods late this afternoon, and I met a man, such a strange sort of man, tall and dark, like a lost soul. The sun was setting, and the light of it through the trees made him look like a kind of harlequin." "Ah!" Mr. Satterthwaite leant forward, his interest quickened. "I wanted to speak to him. He looked so like somebody I know, but I lost him in the trees." "I think I know him," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Do you? He is interesting, isn't he?" "Yes, he is interesting." There was a pause. Mr. Satterthwaite was perplexed. There was something he felt that he ought to do, and he didn't know what it was. "But surely it had to do with this girl," he said rather clumsily. "Sometimes when one is unhappy, one wants to get away." "Yes, that's true," she broke off suddenly. "Oh, I see what you mean that, but you're wrong. It's just the other way round. I wanted to be alone because I'm happy. Happy, terribly happy." She spoke quite quietly, but Mr. Satterthwaite had a sudden sense of shock. What this strange girl meant by being happy wasn't the same as Michele would have meant by the same words. Happiness for Mabel Annesley meant some kind of intense and vivid ecstasy, something that was not only human but more than human. He shrank back a little. "I didn't know," he said clumsily. "Of course you couldn't, and it's not the actual thing. I'm not happy yet, but I'm going to be." She leaned forward. "Do you know what it's like to stand in a wood, a big wood with dark shadows and trees very close all round you, a wood you might never get out of, and then suddenly, just in front of you, you see the country of your dreams, shining and beautiful. You've only got to step out from the trees and the darkness, and you've found it. So many things look beautiful," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "before we've reached them. Some of the ugliest things in the world look the most beautiful." There was a step on the floor. Mr. Satterthwaite turned his head. A fair man with a stupid, rather wooden face stood there. He was the man Mr. Satterthwaite had hardly noticed at the dinner table. "They're waiting for you, Mabel," he said. She got up. The expression had gone out of her face. Her voice was flat and calm. "I'm coming, Gerard," she said. "I've been talking to Mr. Satterthwaite." She went out of the room, Mr. Satterthwaite following. He turned his head over his shoulder as he went and caught the expression on her husband's face, a hungry, despairing look. "Enchantment," thought Mr. Satterthwaite. "He feels it right enough. Poor fellow, poor fellow." The drawing-room was well lighted. Madge and Doris Coles were vociferous in reproaches. "Mabel, you little beast, you've been ages." She sat on a low stool, tuned the ukulele, and sang. They all joined in. "Is it possible," thought Mr. Satterthwaite, "that so many idiotic songs could have been written about my baby?" But he had to admit that the syncopated wailing tunes were stirring, though of course they weren't a patch on the old-fashioned waltz. The air got very smoky. The syncopated rhythm went on. No conversation, thought Mr. Satterthwaite. No good musk, no peace. He wished the world had not become definitely so noisy. Suddenly Mabel Annesley broke off, smiled across the room at him, and began to sing a song of Greg's, "My Swan, My Fair One." It was a favorite of Mr. Satterthwaite's. He liked the note of ingenuous surprise at the end. Were it only a swan then? A swan then? After that, the party broke up. Maggie offered drinks whilst her father picked up the discarded ukulele and began twanging it, absent-mindedly. The party exchanged good nights, drifted nearer and nearer to the door. Everyone talked at once. Gerard Annesley slipped away unostentatiously, leaving the others. Outside the drawing-room door, Mr. Satterthwaite bade Mrs. Graham a ceremonious good night. There were 2 staircases, one close at hand, the other at the end of a long corridor. It was by the latter that Mr. Satterthwaite reached his room. Mrs. Graham and her son passed up the stairs near at hand, whence the quiet Gerard Annesley had already preceded them. You'd better get your ukulele, Mabel," said Maggie. "You'll forget it in the morning. If you don't, you've got to make such an early start." "Come on, Mr. Satterthwaite," said Doris Coles, seizing him boisterously by one arm, early to bed. Maggie took him by the other arm, and all 3 ran down the corridor to peals of Doris' laughter. They paused at the end to wait for David Keeley, who was following at a much more sedate pace, turning out electric lights as he came. The four of them went upstairs together. Mr. Satterthwaite was just preparing to descend to the dining room for breakfast on the following morning when there was a light tap on the door and Maggie Keeley entered. Her face was dead white, and she was shivering all over. "Oh, Mr. Satterthwaite, my dear child, what's happened?" He took her hand. Mabel Ansley, yes. What had happened? What? Something terrible, he knew that. Moggy could hardly get the words out. She hanged herself last night on the back of her door. "Oh, it's too horrible," she broke down, sobbing. Hanged herself. Impossible, incomprehensible. He said a few soothing old-fashioned words to Maggie and hurried downstairs. He found David Keeley looking perplexed and incompetent. "I've telephoned to the police, Satterthwaite. Apparently that's got to be done. So the doctor said he's just finished examining the good Lord. It's a beastly business." She must have been desperately unhappy to do it that way. "Queer that song last night. Swan song, eh?" She looked rather like a swan, a black swan. "Yes, swan song," repeated Keeley. "Shows it was in her mind, eh?" "It would seem so. Yes, certainly it would seem so." He hesitated, then asked if he might see if that his host comprehended the stammering request. "If you want to it forgotten, you have a pension for human tragedies." He led the way up the broad staircase. Mr. Satterthwaite followed him. At the head of the stairs was the room occupied by Roger Graham, and opposite it, on the other side of the passage, his mother's room. The latter door was ajar, and a faint wisp of smoke floated through it. A momentary surprise invaded Mr. Satterthwaite's mind. He had not judged Mrs. Graham to be a woman who smoked so early and died. Indeed, he had had the idea that she did not smoke at all. They went along the passage to the end door but one. David Keeley entered the room, and Mr. Satterthwaite followed him. The room was not a very large one, and showed signs of a man's occupation. A door in the wall led into a second room. A bit of cut rope still dangled from a hook high up on the door. On the bed, Mr. Satterthwaite stood for a minute, looking down on the heap of huddled chiffon. He noticed that it was ruched and pleated like the plumage of a bird. At the face, after one glance, he did not look again. He glanced from the door with its dangling rope to the communicating door through which they had come. Was that open? Yes, at least the maid says so. Ansley slept in there. Did he hear anything? He says nothing. All most incredible, murmured Mr. Satterthwaite. He looked back at the form on the bed. "Where is he, Ansley?" "He's downstairs with the doctor." They went downstairs to find an inspector of police had arrived. Mr. Satterthwaite was agreeably surprised to recognize in him an old acquaintance, Inspector Winkfield. The inspector went upstairs with the doctor, and a few minutes later a request came that all members of the house party should assemble in the drawing room. The blinds had been drawn, and the whole room had a funereal aspect. Doris Coles looked frightened and subdued. Every now and then she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Madge was resolute and alert, her feelings fully under control by now. Mrs. Graham was composed as always, her face grave and impassive. The tragedy seemed to have affected her son more keenly than anyone. He looked a positive wreck this morning. David Keeley, as usual, had subsided into the background. The bereaved husband sat alone, a little apart from the others. There was a queer, dazed look about him, as though he could hardly realize what had taken place. Mr. Satterthwaite, outwardly composed, was inwardly seething with the importance of a duty shortly to be performed. Inspector Winkfield, followed by Dr. Morris, came in and shut the door behind him. He cleared his throat and spoke. "This is a very sad occurrence, very sad, I'm sure. It's necessary under the circumstances that I should ask everybody a few questions. You'll not object, I'm sure. It'll begin with, Mr. Ansley, you'll forgive my asking, sir, but had your good lady ever threatened to take her life?" Mr. Satterthwaite opened his lips impulsively, then closed them again. There was plenty of time. "Better not speak too soon. No, I don't think so." His voice was so hesitating, so peculiar, that everyone shot a covert glance at him. "You're not sure, sir?" "Yes, I'm quite sure she didn't. Were you aware that she was unhappy in any way?" No, I wasn't." "She said nothing to you about feeling depressed, for instance?" No, nothing." Whatever the inspector thought, he said nothing. Instead, he proceeded to his next point. "Will you describe to me briefly the events of last night? We all went up to bed. I fell asleep immediately and heard nothing. The housemaid's scream aroused me this morning. I rushed into the adjoining room and found my wife, and found her." His voice broke. The inspector nodded. Yes, that's quite enough. We needn't go into that. When did you last see your wife the night before?" Downstairs. Downstairs? Yes, we all left the drawing room together. I went straight up, leaving the others talking in the hall." "And you didn't see your wife again?" "Didn't she say good night when she came up to bed?" "I was asleep when she came up, but she only followed you a few minutes later." "That's right, isn't it, sir?" He looked at David Keeley, who nodded. "She hadn't come up half an hour later." Ansley spoke stubbornly. The inspector's eyes strayed gently to Mrs. Graham. "She didn't stay in your room talking, madam. Did Mr. Satterthwaite fancy it? Or was there a slight pause before Mrs. Graham said with her customary quiet decision of manner, 'No, I went straight into my room and closed the door. I heard nothing.'" "And you say, sir," the inspector had shifted his attention back to Ansley, "that you slept and heard nothing. The communicating door was open, was it not?" I believe so, but my wife would have entered her room by the other door from the corridor." "Even so, sir, there would have been certain sounds, a choking noise, a drumming of heels on the door?" "Ah, no, it was Mr. Satterthwaite, who spoke impetuously, unable to stop himself. Every eye turned towards him in surprise. He himself became nervous, stammered, and turned pink. 'I beg your pardon, Inspector, but I must speak.' "Oh, you are on the wrong track altogether. Mrs. Ansley did not kill herself. I am sure of it. She was murdered." There was a dead silence. Then Inspector Wingfield said quietly, "What leads you to say that, sir?" It is a feeling, a very strong feeling, but I think, sir, there must be more than that to it. There must be some particular reason." "Well, of course, there was a particular reason. There was the mysterious message from Mr. Quinn, but you couldn't tell a police inspector that. Mr. Satterthwaite cast about desperately and found something. Last night when we were talking together, she said she was very happy. Very happy. Just that. That wasn't like a woman thinking of committing suicide. He was triumphant," he added. "She went back to the drawing room to fetch her ukulele so that she wouldn't forget it in the morning. That didn't look like suicide either." "No," admitted the inspector. "No, perhaps it didn't." He turned to David Keeley. "Did she take the ukulele upstairs with her?" The mathematician tried to remember. "I think, yes, she did. She went upstairs carrying it in her hand. I remember seeing it just as she then turned the corner of the staircase before I turned off the light down here." "Oh," cried Madge, "but it's here now." She pointed dramatically to where the ukulele lay on a table. "That's curious," said the inspector. He stepped swiftly across and rang the bell. A brief order sent the butler in search of the housemaid, whose business it was to do the rooms in the morning. She came and was quite positive in her answer. The ukulele had been there first thing that morning when she had dusted. Inspector Wingfield dismissed her and then said curtly, "I would like to speak to Mr. Satterthwaite in private, please." "Everyone may go, but no one is to leave the house." Mr. Satterthwaite twitted into speech as soon as the door had closed behind the others. I am sure, Inspector, that you have the case excellently in hand." "Excellently? I just felt that having, as I say, a very strong feeling—" The inspector arrested further speech with an upraised hand. "You're quite right, Mr. Satterthwaite. The lady was murdered. You knew it?" Mr. Satterthwaite was chagrined. There were certain things that puzzled Dr. Morris. He looked across at the doctor who had remained, and the doctor assented to his statement with a nod of the head. "We made a thorough examination. The rope that was round her neck wasn't the rope that she was strangled with. It was something much thinner that did the job, something more like a wire. It had cut right into the flesh. The mark of the rope was superimposed on it. She was strangled and then hung up on the door afterwards to make it look like suicide." "But who? Paul?" "Yes," said the inspector. "Who? That's the question. What about the husband sleeping next door who never said good night to his wife and who heard nothing? I should say we hadn't far to look. Must find out what terms they were on. That's where you can be useful to us, Mr. Satterthwaite. You've the entree here, and you can get the hang of things in a way we can't. Find out what relations there were between the two I hardly like." Again Mr. Satterthwaite stiffening. "It won't be the first murder mystery you've helped us with. I remember the case of Mrs. Strangeways." "You've got a flair for that sort of thing, sir, An absolute flare. Yes, it was true. He had a flare. He said quietly, "I will do my best." Inspector, had Gerard Annesley killed his wife? Had he? Mr. Satterthwaite recalled that look of daft misery last night. He loved her, and he was suffering. Suffering will drive a man to strange deeds. But there was something else, some other factor. Mabel had spoken of herself as coming out of a wood. She was looking forward to happiness, not a quiet, rational happiness, but a happiness that was irrational, a wild ecstasy. If Gerard Annesley had spoken the truth, Mabel had not come to her room till at least half an hour later than he had done. Yet David Keeley had seen her going up those stairs. There were 2 other rooms occupied in that wing. There was Mrs. Graham's, and there was her son's, but he and Madge. Surely Madge would have guessed, but Madge wasn't the guessing kind. All the same, no smoke without fire. Smoke? Ah, he remembered, a wisp of smoke curling out through Mrs. Graham's bedroom door. He acted an impulse. Straight up the stairs and into her room. It was empty. He closed the door behind him and locked it. He went across to the grate, a heap of charred fragments. Very gingerly he raked them over with his finger. His luck was in. In the very center were some unburnt fragments of letters, very disjointed fragments, but they told him something of value. Life can be wonderful, Roger darling. I never knew. All my life has been a dream till I met you, Roger. Gerard knows, I think. I am sorry. But what can I do? Nothing is real to me but you, Roger. We shall be together soon. What are you going to wear? Tell him at Laydell, Roger? You write strangely, but I am not afraid. Very carefully, Mr. Satterthwaite put the fragments into an envelope from the writing table. He went to the door, unlocked it, and opened it to find himself face to face with Mrs. Graham. It was an awkward moment, and Mr. Satterthwaite was momentarily out of countenance. He did what was, perhaps, the best thing, attacked the situation with simplicity. I have been searching your room, Mrs. Graham. I have found something. A packet of letters, imperfectly burnt. A wave of alarm passed over her face. It was gone in a flash, but it had been there. Letters from Mrs. Annesley to your son. She hesitated for a minute, then said quietly, "That is so. I thought they would be better burnt." "For what reason?" "My son is engaged to be married." These letters, if they had been brought into publicity through the poor girl's suicide, might have caused much pain and trouble. Your son could burn his own letters. She had no answer ready for that. Mr. Satterthwaite pursued his advantage. You found these letters in his room, brought them into your room, and burnt them. Why? You were afraid, Mrs. Graham? I am not in the habit of being afraid, Mr. Satterthwaite. No, but this was a desperate case. Desperate? Your son might have been in danger of arrest. For murder. He saw her face go white. He went on quickly. You heard Mrs. Annesley go into your son's room last night. He had told her of his engagement. No, I see he hadn't. He told her. Then they quarreled, and that's a lie. They had been so absorbed in their duel of words that they had not heard approaching footsteps. Roger Graham had come up behind them, unperceived by either. It's all right, Mother. Don't worry. Come into my room, Mr. Satterthwaite. Mr. Satterthwaite followed him into his room. Mrs. Graham had turned away and did not attempt. Roger Graham shut the door. Listen, Mr. Satterthwaite, you think I killed Mabel? You think I strangled her here and took her along and hung her up on that door later, when everyone was asleep? Mr. Satterthwaite stared at him. Then he said surprisingly, No, I do not think so. Thank God for that. I couldn't have killed Mabel. I loved her. Or didn't I? I don't know. It's a tangle that I can't explain. Am fond of Madge. I always have been, and she's such a good sort. We silt each other. But Mabel was different. It was, I can't explain it, a sort of enchantment I think, afraid of her. Mr. Satterthwaite nodded. It was madness, a kind of bewildering ecstasy. But it was impossible. It wouldn't have worked. That sort of thing doesn't last. I know what it means now to have a spell cast over you. Yes, it must have been like that, said Mr. Satterthwaite thoughtfully. I wanted to get out of it all. I was going to tell Mabel last night, but you didn't. No, I didn't, said Graham slowly. I swear to you, Mr. Satterthwaite, that I never saw her after I said good night downstairs. I believe you, said Mr. Satterthwaite. He got up. It was not Roger Graham who had killed Mabel Annesley. He could have fled from her, but he could not have killed her. He had been afraid of her, afraid of that wild, intangible, fairy-like quality of hers. He had known enchantment, and turned his back on it. He had gone for the safe, sensible thing that he had known would work and had relinquished the intangible dream that might lead him he knew not where. He was a sensible young man, and as such uninteresting to Mr. Satterthwaite, who was an artist and a connoisseur in life. He left Roger Graham in his room and went downstairs. The drawing room was empty. Mabel's ukulele lay on a stool by the window. He took it up and twanged it absent-mindedly. He knew nothing of the instrument, but his ear told him that it was abominably out of tune. He turned a key experimentally. Doris Coles came into the room. She looked at him reproachfully. "Poor Mabel's UK," she said. Her clear condemnation made Mr. Satterthwaite feel obstinate. "Tune it for me," he said, and added, "if you can." "Of course I can," said Doris, wounded at the suggestion of incompetence in any direction. She took it from him, twanged a string, turned a key briskly, and the string snapped. "Well, oh, I see, but how extraordinary. It's the wrong string. A size too big. It's an A string. How stupid to put that on." "Of course it snaps when you try to tune it up. How stupid people are." "Yes," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "they are, even when they try to be clever." His tone was so odd that she stared at him. He took the ukulele from her and removed the broken string. He went out of the room holding it in his hand. In the library he found David Keeley. Here, he said, he held out the string. Keeley took it. "What's this? A broken ukulele string." He paused and then went on. "What did you do with the other one?" "The other one? The one you strangled her with? You were very clever, weren't you?" "It was done very quickly. Just in that moment we were all laughing and talking in the hall. Mabel came back into this room for her ukulele. You had taken the string off as you fiddled with it just before. You caught her round the throat with it and strangled her. Then you came out and locked the door and joined us. Later, in the dead of night, you came down and disposed of the body by hanging it on the door of her room, and you put another string on the ukulele. But it was the wrong string. That's why you were stupid." There was a pause. "But why did you do it?" said Mr. Satterthwaite. "In God's name? Why?" Mr. Keeley laughed. A funny, giggling little laugh that made Mr. Satterthwaite feel rather sick. "It was so very simple," he said, "that's why. And then nobody ever noticed me. Nobody ever noticed what I was doing. I thought I'd have the laugh of them." And again he gave that furtive little giggle and looked at Mr. Satterthwaite with mad eyes. Mr. Satterthwaite was glad that at that moment Inspector Winkefield came into the room. It was 24 hours later, on his way to London, that Mr. Satterthwaite awoke from a doze to find a tall, dark man sitting opposite to him in the railway carriage. He was not altogether surprised, "My dear Mr. Quinn, yes, I am here," Mr. Satterthwaite said slowly. "I can hardly face you. I am ashamed. I failed. Are you so sure of that?" "I did not save her. But you discovered the truth?" "Yes, that is true. One or other of those young men might have been accused, might even have been found guilty. So at any rate I saved a man's life, but she that strange, enchanting creature," his voice broke off. Mr. Quinn looked at him. "Is death the greatest evil that can happen to anyone? Perhaps no." Mr. Satterthwaite remembered Madge and Roger Graham, Mabel's face in the moonlight, its serene, unearthly happiness. "No," he admitted. "No, perhaps death is not the greatest evil." He remembered the ruffled blue chiffon of her dress that had seemed to him like the plumage of a bird with a broken wing. When he looked up, he found himself alone. Mr. Quinn was no longer there, but he had left something behind. On the seat was a roughly carved bird fashioned out of some dim blue stone. It had possibly no great artistic merit, but it had something else. It had the vague quality of enchantment. So said Mr. Satterthwaite, and Mr. Satterthwaite was a connoisseur. Thank you very much for listening to this story, narrated by Jason Fraser. Don't forget to subscribe to the Detective Tales channel and be sure to leave a comment.